Welcome, everyone. Let's wait a few seconds as we see participants joining in and connecting to our webinar episode today. But welcome to episode 13 of our COVID-19 Religion and Belief webinar series. Today, our host, Dr. Pasquale Annicchino, will share a panel of distinguished representatives of the governments of Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. You should have received their bios. Together, they will analyze the current situation and highlight the policy options for future engagement. And we look forward to their presentations. Now I invite all of the panelists and the participants to respond to our traditional poll that you will see on your screen. It will give you and our speakers also an idea of our global audience. So thank you very much for taking a minute to respond. Now, for your information, the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on social media. The recording will be available on our CIRIS landing page, where we also publish information about the upcoming episodes, and you will see the link in the chat box. Important, you can type your questions or upvote order questions at any time using the Q&A tool on the bottom of your screen. Please keep your text short and to the point, making it easier for the moderators to pass them on. If you get disconnected, just use the link that you have received when you register to join back in. Finally, I would like to recognize the sponsoring institutions of this webinar series: the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies, the Center for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation, the Center for Justice and Society at Fundação Getulio Vargas Law School of Rio de Janeiro, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham University Law School, the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the University of Siena. I will now broadcast the results of the live poll and hand the panel over to Pasquale. Pasquale, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you very much to the organizing institutions and to the speakers who have accepted to be with us today. I'm very glad to chair this panel on a topic which is quite hot, to use a very common adjective today, given what is happening in the world. And we see also actions from some of the states which are represented here today. And I hope that we will hear from this person that represent also the different member states, which kind of engagement and action their states are taking globally to promote and protect freedom of religion or belief. Now we have a very distinct and precise angle through which we look at this topic today, which is the perspective of 3 states that during the years and historically have done a lot to promote and protect freedom of religion and belief, especially from an institutional point of view. These 3 states have been key in thinking and developing institutional solutions from the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief, which then have been adapted also in other contexts. I am quite sure, I've been writing about that we would not have today the actions of the European Union on the promotion and protection of freedom of religion and belief if we did not have the experience in the US years before. So in a kind of a troubled time politically, socially, and epidemiologically, I very much look forward to hear from our speakers today. You have already received their bios, but I want to mention again all of them with their institutional role, and then I will introduce them after the first speaker. So we have Rita French. Rita is the Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN in Geneva and International Ambassador for Human Rights for the United Kingdom. We have Maenza. She's the Vice Chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, a key institution in this domain. And then we are honored to have Tamara Mawhinney. Tamara is the Deputy Permanent Representative to the Permanent Mission of Canada to the UN in Geneva. Having done my first duties, I'm very happy to give the floor to Rita to hear an initial perspective from the UK. Rita, I'm very happy to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasquale, and good afternoon from Geneva. I appreciate it's morning in other parts of the world, but pleasure to be part of this webinar this afternoon, this morning, across the different regions. First of all, just to say apologies from the British Prime Minister's Special Envoy, Mr. Ray Manchester, who was due to speak, who is unable to attend this webinar and who sends his apologies. I think the outbreak of COVID-19 has put immense pressure on communities over the world, particularly those that are vulnerable to discrimination and prejudice. As the UK's international ambassador, I've spent the last few months working closely with my international counterparts to both encourage responses to the pandemic to be targeted, time limited and subject to review, and assess the impact of COVID-19 on human rights. And while the immediate health effects of the pandemic have undoubtedly affected some communities more than others, today I would like to discuss how the secondary effects of the pandemic are impacting religious and minority communities in an unprecedented way, which requires a whole of society approach to tackle. I think there are broad themes that I really want to kind of put onto the table today. The first is how we respond to the growing incidence of concern, including religiously motivated intolerance and hate, and reports of denial of aid to minority communities. From a UK perspective, we are pleased to see that the UN has already published a guidance note on addressing COVID-19 related hate speech, which stresses that member states have the primary responsibility, whilst for tackling COVID-19 hate speech, other actors, tech and social media companies, mainstream media and civil society also have a significant role to play. And it's been great to see over the recent weeks and months some of those private sector communities also stepping up as well. Remaining vigilant to rising hate speech and the impact this has on FoRB is important. We should all continue to use our voice internationally to promote and respect the understanding between different religious and belief groups and counter disinformation, while continuing to support freedom of expression, both as a fundamental right in itself, but also as an essential element of a full range of human rights. The second theme is about how to ensure responses to the pandemic are targeted, time limited and subject to regular review. From a UK perspective, this is vital. COVID-19 cannot be a pretense to abuse or violate human rights. While restrictions to the right to FoRB have taken place in most countries around the world, for example, with places of worship being closed, we must all work together to ensure that any limitations are in full accordance with international human rights law. Civil society and faith leaders play a crucial role in both supporting governments' legitimate restrictions to FoRB where necessary for public health reasons, but also holding governments to account if challenges emerge. And then finally, a third theme is to look at the unique role of faith leaders, faith and belief leaders. They have an important role to play around the world during this pandemic. Many have supported their governments to convey credible health and safety messages. We should encourage the inclusion of religious leaders in the development and implementation of response plans to COVID-19, as well as encourage leaders to support one another and refute incidents of intolerance and hatred. The COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly brought out the best in many religious and belief communities around the world. We have seen remarkable acts of kindness, including enhanced efforts to care for the vulnerable, actively sharing credible advice on health and safety precautions, and willingly sacrificing traditional religious practices to protect themselves and the wider public from infection. But as I've mentioned, we have also seen incidents of particular concern. Defending the right to freedom of religion or belief and promoting respect between different religious and non-religious communities is a human rights policy priority for the UK. Over the past few months, the UK has been working closely with international counterparts to explore what else we can do to support communities. The Prime Minister's Special Envoy has publicly called for prisoners of conscience to be released, along with his counterparts from the US and the Netherlands. The Minister for Human Rights has hosted a roundtable with faith-based leaders and organisations to explore what else the UK can do to help vulnerable faith groups. And last month, I jointly, together with 8 colleagues, human rights ambassadors, launched a campaign on media to kind of draw attention to the impact of COVID-19 on freedom of religion or belief. And I also recently joined the Foreign Secretary's roundtable meeting with NGOs and academics to look at the impact of COVID-19 on human rights across the spectrum. Civil society, religious and secular actors are vital partners and critical friends of government. They provide honest and candid advice and urge us to do more than before. It is vital that we all continue to work together to address this global challenge that we face. And I very much look forward to participating and hearing your thoughts on this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, for this kick-off statement on a good survey on what the UK has been doing recently to tackle all the different issues that COVID-19 has brought. And thank you very much for your work and commitment in Geneva on behalf of the UK government and for all religious minorities. Now we are going to hear from Nadine Maenza, which, as I mentioned before, is the Vice Chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. As you can see from her bio, Nadine has extensive experience on religious freedom, religious engagement, and so on. And it is my impression that she probably is one of the best persons to let us know also the kind of atmosphere which is going on in Washington, D.C. today, and really the US perspective on this, both internally and externally. So I'm very much looking forward to hear from her. Nadine, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the organizers of this event in letting us be a part of this important discussion. So as you heard, I'm a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USIRF. So we are a bipartisan independent government agency that monitors religious freedom conditions abroad, so we don't look domestically. We use international standards, and we make recommendations to the President, to the Secretary of State, and to Congress. So our 9 commissioners are appointed by the President, as well as the Republican and Democratic leaders of the House and the Senate. So we are independent of the administration, so we act as a watchdog to ensure religious freedom remains a priority for U.S. foreign policy. So during this pandemic, we have been continuing to monitor religious freedom conditions abroad, and we have several concerns that I'd love to share with you today. So USIRF first is alarmed that governments are restricting religious freedom under the pretext of fighting COVID-19. While freedom of religion and belief is subject to restrictions under very specific public health or other conditions in international law, some governments are imposing restrictions with prejudice towards specific religious communities. In Saudi Arabia, the government suspended entry to and exit from the majority Shia Muslim Eastern Province on the ground that Iran, the majority Shia Muslim country, one of the kingdom's chief rivals, was a hotbed of COVID-19. In India, the Home Ministry directed states to trace members of the Rohingya Muslim community, accusing them of being spreaders of COVID-19, but not other religious groups whose members had been flouting social distancing rules. And in Turkey, we have seen a rise in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are blaming Jews for COVID-19, which pro-government media has been amplifying. In South Korea, local prosecutors threatened to sue the Shincheonji Church after a member fell ill attending church services and spread the disease widely. And in Iran, the Gonbadi Sufis in the Great Tehran prison and Ibn prison were moved into wards with known cases of COVID-19. Note that these and some other governments are not countering hate speech and conspiracies against religious minorities accused of spreading COVID-19. So the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Dr. Ahmed Shahid, said, it is critical that states establish effective strategies and channels of communication to provide accurate and reliable information to the public. The UN's guidance on addressing COVID-19 hate speech similarly recommends states ensure that accurate and verified information on the pandemic is disseminated and included with public messaging against COVID-19 related hate speech, disinformation, misinformation, and conspiracy theories. Nonetheless, some governments have not taken sufficient action when minority religion groups are blamed for the spread of COVID-19. For example, in Pakistan, the illness is sometimes described as the Shia virus, and its spread is attributed to members of the Hazara Shia community. USIRF is concerned about the use of internet restrictions to block the access of religious communities to health information. They may limit the ability of an entire religious community to get health information needed to ensure their own community's health. In Burma's Rakhine and Chin states, where military operations in recent years have targeted civilian populations, the government has continued an internet blackout in 9 townships, despite reports of COVID-19 cases in the area. In neighboring Bangladesh, I've personally stayed in touch with Rohingya in refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, as they are struggling with internet restrictions. It is so slow it barely works, and most websites won't load. This is under the pretext of government efforts to fight crime, hampering their ability to receive public health information and humanitarian assistance. In early June, the first death from COVID-19 was reported in the camps. NGO and public health experts have warned of the vulnerability of the Rohingya refugee to the disease, given the unsanitary and crowded conditions in the camp. We are especially concerned that religious prisoners of conscience are at high risk of contracting COVID-19 while in prison. USCIRF has been working with members of Congress and the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom to raise the issue of religious prisoners of conscience safety with other governments. These prisoners are already unjustly detained for their peaceful expression of religious beliefs. Now they also face a prospect of serious illness or even death as a result of incarceration in crowded and often unsanitary prisons. Some countries have furloughed certain prisoners while keeping religious prisoners of conscience in dangerous conditions. We continue to speak out about the Chinese government's detention of over 1 million Uyghur and other Muslims in Xinjiang in concentration camps as part of their crackdown on religious freedom. It has been difficult to get accurate information about the impact of COVID-19. There has been widespread reports of forced labor. In March, it appears the government transferred Uyghurs to factories in other parts of China in order to avoid having to close those factories due to the coronavirus. The report of forced labor indicates that the Chinese government is trafficking in the slave labor of religious minorities. We've also seen the weaponizing of COVID crisis by governments to further their own agendas, having a negative impact on religious minorities. At a congressional hearing hosted by USCIRF on June 10th on safeguarding religious freedom in Northeast Syria, Human Rights Watch testified that Turkey is weaponizing water by repeatedly cutting water supply to 460,000 people in Hasaka Governorate in Northeast Syria. That includes 3 IDP camps. This is making it difficult for humanitarian organizations to prepare and protect vulnerable communities during this COVID-19 pandemic. Human Rights Watch also testified that Russia and China continue to use their seats on the UN Security Council to veto authorization of the Al Ura Bay border crossing from Iraq into Northeast Syria, which is mainly used by the World Health Organization to supply medical aid for COVID-19 and by the UN for the delivery of humanitarian aid. On Tuesday, Secretary Pompeo issued a statement calling on the border crossing to be open for the delivery of aid and medicine. USCIRF will continue to monitor these reports and continue to share the information that we find. We are also concerned that some of the restrictions or surveillance we are seeing may stick around beyond the pandemic. It is important that countries know that the US government is watching. Thanks again for this opportunity to represent USCIRF and share our concerns about religious freedom during this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for this introduction. It's a lot of information coming from the US, since a lot of initiatives are taking place and going on these days, and we will go back to that, since I have also personal interest into that. So I look forward to asking you some questions. And between the UK and the US, Canada is the perfect fit to give us a synthesis of an Anglo-Saxon approach. So Tamara Mawhinney, extensive international law background and experience, as you can see from the bios that we have circulated. We look forward to hear from you in your kickoff statement. You have the floor, Tamara.
Thank you very much. And we like to think that we're a synthesis of Anglo-Saxon, mais avec une petite touche francophone aussi. So a synthesis of many diverse elements. Thank you so much for hosting this webinar today. Thank you to the sponsoring institutions. And thank you to my fellow panelists. Very interesting, and I look forward to engaging with you throughout this webinar. I just wanted to highlight that for Canada, the overarching principle guiding our work to promote freedom of religion or belief is the conviction that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. Underlying this is the promotion of inclusion and respect for diversity as key elements towards the protection of human rights. And I think this has proven especially central in the current COVID-19 context. A little bit of historic context. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees freedom of conscience and religion to all Canadians, was enshrined in our Constitution in 1982. And it is a fundamental right of all Canadians to practice their religion or belief, as well as to hold, change, or eschew beliefs without being discriminated against or targeted by violent or abusive acts. We certainly understand that challenges remain. There is no one magical solution to the longstanding concern of discrimination and hatred, which unfortunately there are cases in Canada, as there are worldwide. Xenophobia, from what we have seen, has been amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic as individuals and states face uncertain futures and seek to place blame. Canada's Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion within Global Affairs Canada seeks to promote freedom of religion or belief within the broader frameworks of human rights in bilateral and multilateral forums and Canadian missions abroad. We organize interactive discussions with faith and belief communities and human rights organizations to address emerging concerns on the state of freedom of religion or belief in the world. And of course, now we've learned to do that in a virtual format as well, to respect and ensure the safety of all participants. While the consequences of this pandemic affect everyone around the world, I think, as someone put it, it has proven to be universal, but not equal. It has had a particular and specific impact on religious communities in particular, who in many cases, going back thousands of years, have practiced and expressed their faith in communal settings, but are facing unprecedented challenges in doing so at this time. And governments around the world have understandably implemented extraordinary emergency measures to address the COVID-19 pandemic. But there's a darker side to some of the measures undertaken, measures which under the guise of protection, in fact, may target groups already marginalized by governments or affect them adversely. It is clear that emergency measures to fight COVID-19 must never be used to weaken either democracy or human rights. Recovery, we believe, will depend on accountability, on inclusion, and respect for human rights. And that is why Canada has remained committed to protecting and promoting human rights and democracy at home and abroad through collaboration with like-minded partners, multilateral organizations, and through our international assistance. And it is why we insist that respect for human rights, including freedom of religion or belief, as well as freedom from racial discrimination and hatred, must be at the center of all efforts to contain and combat the spread of COVID-19. And I would draw your attention to a joint statement that our Foreign Minister and our Minister of International Development made early on in the crisis in April, emphasizing the importance of human rights to our COVID-19 response. And I think this crisis has certainly brought home the fact that common challenges, shared challenges, required common and shared solutions. No government can solve this crisis alone. And at the individual country level, we will require collaborative contributions as well from civil society, including religious leaders, to understand the impact of this pandemic and to work together to create viable solutions for the future. Internationally, we will need to address the intersection of freedom of religion or belief and COVID-19 through our various multilateral and bilateral engagements. We must recognize that many situations of religious discrimination and persecution are further aggravated and complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's on or offline. Religious minorities have been wrongfully scapegoated by social movements, targeted by government restrictions, unrelated to the pandemic in the name of national security, or violently attacked in situations where there is a lack of accountability in the context of a global pandemic. And as Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres said, we know from previous public health crises, from HIV/AIDS to Ebola, that the actions of faith leaders influence people's values, attitudes, behaviors, and actions. COVID-19 is no exception. We think there's some very valuable lessons learned from the past that we can draw from. Religious leaders and communities worldwide have demonstrated their resilience, first and foremost, and used their unique platform to innovate and find new ways to hold religious gatherings and mark celebrations while respecting public health advisories. This includes Canadian religious leaders and communities from coast to coast who have followed health officials' guidance, encouraging communities to pursue innovative ways to continue services and prayers, such as conducting them virtually. We also bear witness to the many calls for unity expressed by religious leaders during the pandemic, taking action in solidarity with those of all faiths to address vulnerabilities within our societies. And we're happy to say there have been numerous examples of different communities in Canada stepping up in truly extraordinary ways. I'd be happy to speak to that in the questions, just to not lengthen my intervention. And although we have unfortunately seen the COVID-19 pandemic catalyze new expressions of xenophobia and scapegoating, including against religious minority communities, there are inspirational stories that we hold on to and that remind us of our shared humanity in the face of upheaval and uncertainty. They remind us too of the importance of positive leadership from civil society, religious leaders, and from governments, and ensure that we remember that when we act in solidarity, we are indeed stronger together. So this sustained, courageous commitment and inclusive community engagement from all levels of society enables us to work together toward a stronger global community with no one left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Tamara, thank you very much also for keeping it on time. Now, we have received quite a few questions. I want to start from a general reflection and sending the ball back to your side. And I want to start from this reflection. Recently, the United States have launched the so-called Alliance for International Religious Freedom. The UK is part of this alliance, if I'm not wrong. I think that Canada is not part of that alliance, as many other Western countries, as well as many other countries globally. There are situations in the world on which you have that you have discussed. For instance, for me, the situation in Xinjiang is so so important to be addressed that this requires common efforts. Do you think that among the three different countries you can find common cause to protect and promote freedom of religion belief in cases where the violations are so important, like in the Xinjiang case, that a common response is needed? The floor back to you. I think we can start from Rita.
Apologies, I was just trying to unmute. A very valuable question. And in fact, this week, although I appreciate the United States is not in the Human Rights Council, we made a statement collectively, I think a group of 27 states, talking specifically about the human rights violations, particularly for the Uyghur community in Xinjiang, as well as the situation in Hong Kong. But this is something that we continue to engage with on the multilateral forum, on the international stage on this matter. And I'm also aware that UK ministers actively engage directly with the Chinese government as well on this issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadine.
Yes, no, I believe that there's several approaches that the U.S. government can take, that all the governments can take. The first is for us as U.S. government to do things like impose sanctions, as we've done in China, for instance, for the situation going on in Xinjiang. But also, it is important to work with the international community, and we support the creation of the Alliance for Religious Freedom, and feel that that is a really good opportunity for countries that have shared values, shared beliefs, to be able to speak together into some of these important issues. If we really want to change policy in order to favor religious freedom, it's going to take more than just one country.
Thank you very much. Tamara.
Yes, I think the comments of my two fellow panelists are absolutely correct. We can't do this alone. As I said in our statement, it's very important to work across a broad range of partnerships and engaging at different levels. We are obviously here in Geneva, we're engaging with governments, but also civil society, academics, think tanks. Tous les moyens sont bons. We have to use every possible channel of communication to pass the messages and find new ways to bring the message through truly multilateral and multidimensional diplomacy.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Let me go to some of the questions that we have received live and see if some of the panelists want to address it. So now, for instance, I have this question from Bob Thompson, and he writes that I am concerned with references to COVID-19 as a religious or ethnic virus. I am referring to if referring to it as the Shia virus is wrong, then referring to it as the Kung flu or the Chinese virus for political purpose equally problematic. Tamara, we can start from you now.
Thank you. I think would take me back to my very first comments, that how interrelated and interconnected so many of the human rights are. And I think our sort of connecting theme, and in this time, as in other situations, is to emphasize the importance of diversity and inclusion. Beginning right from preparatory data, make sure you have fully inclusive data for all communities and affected groups, and try and see measures, events, regulations from the perspective of all the different communities who will be covered by those regulations or events. And I think trying to bring in that perspective can help get around this effort to turn COVID-19 into, it's already dreadful enough, but to add in an exclusionary and hateful agenda to it. We all have to work together.
Thank you, Tamara. Rita?
Great, thank you very much. I mean, I think this is a very valid point. I would say that those who are using the banner of COVID to continue to incite against particular groups or incite hate speech or actually incite violence is very dangerous, and it's something that the UK will not stand for. Those incidents are unacceptable and will continue to refute those divisive claims that are being made. It's really important, therefore, that governments and communities are putting out accurate and timely information through all channels, both online, but also, again, thinking about the community we're reaching out to today, the important role of faith leaders and others to ensure that we are counteracting this with the right information. And again, I think civil society has got a valuable role to play, but also journalists and the media more broadly as well. So we're unfortunately in this 24-hour media society, it's impossible to keep on top of everything in this area. But what is really important is that the trusted authorities at all forums are communicating the accurate information, and that information is taken with trust, and that we all rely and broadcast that as often as possible and very quickly, I think, is what's important, to make sure that we very quickly respond to addressing those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. I'm very much looking forward to Nadine on this, because if I'm not wrong, I remember probably a couple of months ago, there was a G8 or G20, and it was impossible to release the final communique because President Trump wanted to put in the communique to name the virus the one virus or something like that. So I don't know what is Nadine's perspective on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say I agree with my colleagues. You've all brought some really important points. In terms of USERF, we don't look at the domestic situation in terms of our own government. We really assess globally. So, what we are trying to do is document other countries. When we're seeing hate speech or scapegoating, we're able to document and share that information and make recommendations to our own government. The reason that USERF doesn't have a domestic role is really to keep us from being political, because then USERF could be, someone could try to use it against their enemies. And the neat thing about USERF is it's never been able to be used that way. So we stay in our lane. We're laser focused on assessing religious freedom conditions at an international standard abroad, and then making recommendations to our own government in order to continue that important work. But yeah, I'm very concerned about all the language I'm hearing, both domestically, personally, and internationally. And I really do believe it is important that we don't minimize anybody over this pandemic moment. I mean, it's really an opportunity for us to stand together, to lift up other voices and to show a lot of empathy to one another. So we will continue at USERF to try to speak into this in the best way that we can. And like others have mentioned, we've also seen some really wonderful opportunities and seen religious communities stand up, and they have been the best partners for governments. So governments don't need to be afraid of the religious communities during this time. I think they should be their partners, and they can also help correct some of this hate speech, the disinformation, because they're trusted in their own communities. And I think that is another part of this, is there's so much information, it's hard for people to figure out, even in the United States, what is true and what is not. and these trusted voices in the religious communities can talk to their own people and explain what is going on, and you know, keep in contact with the government. So, you know, I hope that kind of answers the question the way you hoped I would.
No, I mean, it doesn't perfectly, and thank you very much. I mean, for your answer, and thank you very much again for the incredible amount of work that you CIRIS does. I mean, the work that you do is also very relevant for us as researchers in the field. So thanks for both issues. I have noticed a question from Vargas, which has done a lot of work at the European Parliament on freedom of religion or belief, and he picks on an important point, which is not that directly connected to the three countries, but is connected to the relationship of the three countries with the EU. And I think it's particularly important. Vargas says that the new Commission has not renewed the position of Special Envoy for freedom of religion or belief. That is making it more difficult for the US, Canada, and the UK to build international coalitions to defend and promote freedom of religion or belief. Who is the counter-interlocutor on these issues? So this time we can start from Nadine, maybe, and then we move to the other two panelists. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. So which position wasn't appointed?
The EU Special Envoy for freedom of religion or belief in Brussels.
Okay. Yeah, we really have appreciated all these individual envoys from the different countries being able to speak into these issues and be able to assess, again, internationally, and be able to work with us. So we have found such a good working relationship, and we do believe it's important for each of these countries and for the EU to have that representative that could speak into that. So we do hope that they will reappoint that position.
Thank you very much. Tamara.
Thank you. Yes, it's certainly a multifaceted diplomacy, but single individuals don't always make all the difference. There remain so many close partnerships across the EU for us, certainly, and I know for other countries as well. And I think, as our comments have demonstrated, we are operating at many different levels. And I think one of the formats that we found really useful is an intergovernmental collaboration forum that we founded in 2015, in particular with our American colleagues and other partners from around the world, including in Europe. And so there's many different places where this discussion can continue, and we will certainly engage at every level.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Rita.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, I think what I would say is that I hope, and I don't think it does, dilute the priority that Europe attaches to this agenda. And our European colleagues are very closely engaged on the freedom of religion and belief agenda, certainly in the UN we've seen, and on specific other initiatives such as the Istanbul process. I know, for example, our colleagues in the Netherlands hosted that last year. And so the momentum, and I think Netherlands also has a FoRB envoy as well. So different countries within Europe do have those envoys. Europe does have a special representative for human rights, and obviously within that umbrella, FoRB would clearly fit into that as well. So I hope those conversations continue. We're very fortunate in the UK. We have an ambassador for human rights, we have a minister for human rights, we have a Prime Minister Special Envoy for FoRB, we have a Special Envoy for girls' education, we have a Prime Minister Special Envoy for gender equality. So actually, we're very much committed through those envoy roles as really being able to kind of prioritise and hone in on specific rights within that broad agenda. And I think that benefits us hugely to be able to reach out to colleagues across the spectrum.
Many thanks, Rita. Just to conclude on this, because there is a question from one of our hosts, Professor Marco Ventura, which is strictly connected. Do you allow us to understand if you conceive your action on promotion and protection of international religious freedom, do you still see there a space for a kind of transatlantic Western dimension where the EU plays a role? And it's difficult today in time of Brexit and in times of quite strong also anti-EU sentiment in the US? Or do you see more an action coming from your different perspective with individual member states of the EU? Thank you.
Well, as you know, the UK has left Europe. We're in the transition period, so I'm unable to speak, more broadly, kind of on the European perspective. But certainly from the UK perspective, I think those opportunities continue. And I know there's been conversations being had about ministerial conferences on freedom of religion or belief, and the UK hosting those in the near future as well. So we are very much committed to working with partners both in Europe and across the Atlantic on this agenda. So for us in the UK, this doesn't change.
Tamara.
Thank you. Absolutely. So much of our engagement with our southerly neighbors and our transatlantic neighbors almost goes without saying, and it's a very easy meeting of minds. But I think on this particular issue, outreach to others is also hugely important to broaden perspectives, broaden the data we're able to collect, to hear from other regional organizations, other faith-based organizations, other religious communities. So it's also important to make sure that the door is open for dialogue with a wide range of partners around the world.
Nadine.
Yeah, I do believe that these partnerships are so important, and I think at USCIRF we've really been encouraging all sorts of partnerships. It's especially important for civil society to have the opportunity to speak to governments and to be able to sit at a table and have dialogues, public conversations, often and sometimes, of course, private, to be able to have a better understanding on both ends. We have been very involved in the international religious roundtables, religious freedom roundtables that started in Washington, and Ambassador Brownback attends almost every week. But now they've started in, I think, over 40 countries. And the way that it works is it's government and civil society sitting down and talking about, meeting weekly or every other week, or depending on, the country, and having these conversations about the conditions in their own country and things they could do globally, and just different opportunities to have people dialogue. So I love seeing governments come together, but I also love seeing civil society and governments come together too.
Thank you, Nadine. We have a question from Evelina Okab, which is related more also to the kind of more diplomatic side of your work. So you are probably the best positioned people to answer this. So Evelina says, is there some kind of consensus, growing consensus among countries at the UN to establish a fact-finding mission or a commission of inquiry to look into the atrocities against the Uyghur Muslims in China or against religious minorities in China more broadly, as a mechanism at the UN Human Rights Council? Rita.
Great, thank you very much. Is there a consensus in the UN? If I'm honest, the answer is no. But is there a group of countries that are very much appalled about the situation of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang? Then absolutely, and UK is one of those. And there's been active engagement through statements and letters, and the one I just mentioned this week as well, that we've been working with other countries who are in the UN to try and push this. The other thing we have been calling for is for the High Commissioner to visit Xinjiang and to see for herself the information and the evidence around the situation on the ground. And we understand that she is minded to go. Unfortunately, she made this commitment before the COVID pandemic, and so that program has now stalled as such. But we hope that this will be the start of a beginning of trying to explore and investigate what is actually happening there on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Nadine?
Yes, we would welcome a UN fact-finding mission to Xinjiang, of course. And we, as the U.S. Commission, would also love the opportunity to visit China and to be able to assess the religious freedom conditions, to be able to speak directly with the government. They have made several claims and arguments to some of our findings. So we'd welcome the opportunity to dialogue further with them, and think that if the positions they've taken, that it would be in everyone's interest for them to welcome dialogue with other countries.
And Tamara, thank you, Nadine.
Yes, thanks. Yes, consensus to build on this file is difficult to develop, but there are many different avenues for engagement. And Rita drew particular attention to those, and we're working to make sure that at many different levels, government, civil society, media, academics, that there is engagement to be able to ensure we have the best data and that we continue to shine a light on the status of the Uyghurs in China. So that is absolutely something that we continue to work on here.
Many thanks. One question which also has been raised and we received from the people who registered has to deal with the situation of asylum seekers. In many countries, the exam of requests for asylum has basically been stopped because of COVID-19. What is your perspective from your own country? Has this had an impact on people asking for asylum because of religious persecution, religious reason, and so on? What can you tell us about your own perspective? Maybe we can start with Nadine on that.
Sure. Well, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has repeatedly made recommendations to our own government to raise the cap for refugees. So we know that overall we are taking less than every year. We actually recommended that the cap go back up to the 90,000 that it originally was. And so we do know with COVID that even less are being processed at this point. We believe that people fleeing religious persecution, that there are safe ways they could immigrate, they could, be quarantined. So we would recommend to the US government would consider those people fleeing violence and just ensure ways that they could be safe.
Many thanks, Nadine. Rita?
Great, thank you very much. I mean, of course, the current pandemic makes it very difficult for those seeking asylum, and perhaps the numbers who want to seek asylum is also, the demand is growing for that. I mean, I don't have numbers in terms of the UK position, but what I can say is that all asylum applications in the UK are considered on its merits, and we would not be sending anyone back to a country where we thought they were at risk of persecution because of their freedom of religion or belief.
Thank you, Rita. Tamara?
Thank you so much. I think one of the first conversations we had after we went into lockdown was with the UNHCR and to continue to applaud their work because it's clear that migrant populations, internally displaced individuals are amongst the most vulnerable groups who have suffered in the COVID crisis. So we're certainly doing all we can to focus on their situation and to try and help ensure that they are not targeted even more unfairly than they may already be, and to continue to maintain our close partnership with the UNHCR.
Many thanks, Tamara. Let me go to our kind of final round of intervention by asking you, first of all, of course, to keep your intervention between 3 and 4 minutes, but then asking you what are going to be the priorities for your institution and for your office in the short-term and long-term future. So how do you see from now until the end of the year, and then in the more distant future, what will be the priorities of your different offices and institutions? We can start with Nadine.
Great, thank you. Well, our mission at USCIRF is to advance international freedom of religion or belief by independently assessing and unflinchingly confronting threats to this fundamental right. So, in the short term with COVID, obviously a lot of our work is going to be considering the conditions right now of religious freedom around the world and how the pandemic has impacted that. But we are still going to continue to also speak into all the other conditions we see that are impacting religious freedom. And the one thing that's unique about USCIRF, as I mentioned earlier, we're independent of the US government, even though we're a government agency, so we're a watchdog. But we also don't consider the geopolitical relationship the United States has with the country that we're speaking about. So we put on blinders and we try to laser focus on religious freedom and only consider the conditions. So from a short term, we're going to continue to do what we've been doing, but also add in how the pandemic is impacting that. We also are, long-term are going to continue to be unflinching in how we speak about countries that are committing atrocities against religious minorities or religious communities in general. And because we're not a political entity and we stay in our lane, I hope that we'll have a long-term role in U.S. policies. To be able to continue to advocate for the global freedom of religion or belief.
Many thanks, Nadine. Rita.
Great, thank you very much. I think the short-term priority is, of course, ensuring that, particularly for this COVID pandemic, that we do not see a deterioration in terms of freedom of religion or belief happening. And so our long-term objective, of course, is to continue to champion this agenda, and we'll continue to do that through all forums. But in the short term, we need to ensure that we are identifying where those challenges are happening and calling out against those. So I think the more that civil society, those who might be on this webinar, the more you can draw attention to where some of those challenges exist, and you have information on the ground, then it's great to inform us around it. But equally, where the communities are working positively together in terms of best practice, because I feel that sometimes the lockdown measures of the pandemic are just taken as a one model, one solution fits all approach, and they have not always taken into account the sensitivities of different religious groups and minority groups, which may say, rather than a blanket closure of certain communities or places of worship, there may be different ways of doing things, while still, respecting the kind of the health requirements and the social distancing requirements that may be done. So I think the more we can learn and share from that experience, I think that would be really, really important. I think the other is to really sort of say that, yes, of course, the pandemic has probably exasperated some of the concerns for these communities, but we've got to recognise that access to places of worship and freedom of religion and belief for those who do believe actually gives people hope and aspiration during this very difficult and uncertain time. And it's really important that we can safeguard that. So we need to engage with faith-based leaders, with the communities, to really come up with solutions, both in the short term to address the kind of the pandemic, but also as we rebuild beyond the pandemic. And I think it's going to be really important in the rebuilding phase, when we think about the economic and the social impacts more broadly as well, that we engage these communities to build back, using the UN Secretary General's phrases, build back better. And I think there's an opportunity that we need to think about. So how do we turn the dial in a constructive way and bring in new voices, new conversations to help us rebuild our communities in an inclusive approach that includes everyone, including those who may be at fear of persecution or other hate speech, etc. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rita. Tamara.
Thank you. Le mot de la fin. Thank you so much. And in fact, Rita's comments tie in nicely. I saw in one of the questions asked, somebody was emphasizing how important religion is as an element for so many of the world's citizens, and that they emphasize it in responding to polls and surveys. And so the role of religion and how it has helped, hopefully as much as possible as we emerge from this pandemic, I think will be something that will deserve great focus and nurturing. For us, short-term, medium, long-term is maintaining laser-like focus on diversity and inclusion. And that's both in our human rights interactions, but as we look to address the getting out of this pandemic as well. So on the health side. And I think it's interesting. I think this crisis has changed many of our perceptions. And I think one of the big trends we may see emerging is a new role for government, and a very large role, particularly in trying to provide economic support to those who've been adversely affected by the pandemic. And so I think it places on us a special responsibility to ensure that as much as ever, and perhaps more than before, that human rights remain at the center of all that governments do in addressing this pandemic. And so we will certainly be trying to do some big thinking on that, to think about how we can do better in terms of mainstreaming human rights in our responses on this health crisis. And of course, looking ahead, I think the next big hurdle on the health front is developing a vaccine, obviously, but then making sure that that vaccine is accessible to as many people as possible, and that there's no unfairness in how access to that vaccine is determined. And I think it'll be very important to ensure that a human rights approach is applied to that scientific and regulatory challenge. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Since we have been good enough to save a couple of minutes, I will never miss the opportunity to ask you, the three of you, this question. Since we have a panel of three engaged, competent, and women in a leadership position in this sense, we all know that the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief has published his annual report just when the pandemic was started. I think it was March the 5th or the 6th, if I'm not wrong. And that report is exactly about gender and freedom of religion or belief. I think that report will be much discussed over the next few months. Also because, I mean, we know, and especially this is particularly true in the Anglo-Saxon world, there is an internal dividing cultural political line between religion and religious freedom and gender-related rights. Now, of course, I think that we should aim to reconcile the protection of both sets of rights. So I want to ask you how to see future actions starting from the report of the Special Rapporteur exactly at the intersection of these topics of gender and freedom of religion. So we can start with Rita and then conclude here. Rita.
Thank you very much. You built up that question so well with your kindness, so we must respond. The Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief, Mr. Shahid, is very well respected and regarded, and his analysis always engages a constructive debate on this matter, and he is very keen and committed to advancing this. But you finish with a very quite big and broad question. I mean, I think for me, the principle is very much that all of these rights are equal. They're not divisive or competing in any kind of way. So there is sometimes a challenge, I appreciate, kind of between the gender rights and some of the rights enshrined in individual faiths, I guess, or kind of the cultures around it. I mean, I think. But looking at the kind of the COVID agenda more broadly, what I would say is that likewise, I think the gender impact of COVID-19 has also been quite significant. So we know the data which shows that on the whole, more deaths result. Men are more likely to die from the COVID pandemic and COVID-19 than women, but the secondary impacts, whether that's economic or social, disproportionate impact on women. And again, so it's really important that we are thinking about 50% of the population, about how we engage in those solutions more broadly. And again, I think the frontline workers themselves, have 70% of them are women, and they're the ones who are actually delivering the solutions and helping us through this pandemic as such. And it's really important that they are part of that solution, and that solution includes all parts of the community and the economy as well. So I think kind of again, making sure that we have those gender voices in those dialogues with faith leaders and with communities as we think about those solutions, perhaps is one way of also thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Tamara?
Thank you. Yes, well, Dr. Shahid has been tremendously influential in his time as Special Rapporteur. His work weaves through much of our own thinking on these issues. And the great test, I think, will be the relevance of those reports that were issued just as lockdown occurred. That was the old world and this is the new, but I do think that his report will stand the test of time, and it raises very valid issues that we're going to want to look at. And I think the intersection, as Rita said, between gender and the pandemic, it perhaps invites us to see some of these issues in new ways. And maybe throw it back in terms of a question. I think one of the challenges from a gender perspective, and I think this can apply across the board to when we're talking about minorities, is how to get away from being seen only as victims, and how to involve these different perspectives as decision makers and deciders and people of influence. And so I think that's going to be one of the elements that we should look at in this domain, is to bring forward some voices for different perspectives on freedom of religion or belief, and then as well in the pandemic context. And I think it will bring forth some new challenges that we will want to address. Thanks.
Many thanks, Tamara. And before we give the floor to Francesco to conclude, Nadine, you have the final word on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, I personally stay in touch with Dr. Shahid and appreciate his voice and the important role he has in the international religious freedom community. We really do appreciate his report on anti-Semitism, as well as the recent one that he just did on gender. You know, we have found at USCIRF that women are often the most vulnerable members of religious minorities. They're often the first ones to feel the brunt of persecution. And of course, you know, the violence against women, the sexual violence against women is horrific in a lot of these communities. And so we at USCIRF produced a report about the intersection of these two issues in, I believe it was 2018. And we've continued to have briefings and try to better understand, have people from different communities come and present how women in particular are being impacted, to try to make sure that the policies that we're recommending are also helping women in those religious communities as well. So we think that's an important topic, and we appreciate Dr. Shahid's voice to continue speaking into that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Nadine, and thanks to Rita and Tamara as well for being with us today. A very enriching experience for me, and I think, and I hope also for all the audience which has been with us. Francesco will give you back the floor to conclude and to announce the next steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pasquale. Thank you to our panelists. It has been wonderful, the level of questions and the answers and the number of questions that have been raised. Thank you so much. It's been very, very enriching. And on behalf of the sponsoring institutions, I would like to thank you once more for being with us today. And so I would like to invite everyone to give a virtual round of applause to our panel and the hosts who made this possible. Let me just mention what's happening next. Registration on our landing page will open soon for our next episodes on next week, the 9th of July at 3 p.m. Brussels time. This will be our 14th and concluding episode of our webinar series. We will wrap up all things that we have learned over the past 3 exciting months we spent together on Thursdays, and we will try to identify some of the scenarios moving forward and the lessons learned. So watch out for more details and registration on our landing page, and or our email invitations that will be sent in the next day or 2. Although we cannot see you, we appreciate your support throughout the series, and we look forward to welcoming you next Thursday. And again, on behalf of everyone on the call, have a wonderful day, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.